So today we're going to be looking at the collapse of Bronze Age civilization, and chapters 4 and 5 in particular takes us up almost to the very end of our book with Eric Cline. So just as a reminder here, one of the areas we're starting off with is Ugarit, which is in northwestern Syria. You can see on the map right here where that area is located, and you can also see many of the other areas that we've been talking about over the last couple weeks. So just to kind of zoom us in here to more contemporary context, there is the town of Ugarit here on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And if you remember, this is the larger area we've been looking at with Athens, contemporary Greece here, Mycenae in our period, and the area that controls the Hittites going down into this land of Canaan that we've been looking at. So just as a kind of zoom into today, this is what the area where the city itself of Ugarit that our author talks about has been discovered, and you can see the boundaries of the excavation areas here and some of the specific remains in this area that have been recently explored. And if we zoom in, you can see the outlines of some of these original both palatial areas as well as some of the houses that our author talks about. This is a reconstruction of what scholars and archaeologists think Ugarit might have looked like based on evidence that's available from excavations and other records so far. And you can see in the sort of far area out here, this would be the port area of the Mediterranean. So this is what's left of the major palace entrance there that we saw some of those aerial shots from, known as Ras Shamra. And as our author talked about, the kingdom of Ugarit itself, as we saw, is in northern Syria on the coast there, in the northwestern part of what's modern-day Syria. And based on the records, we know that at least 3 different major languages are being employed and used at that time by traders, diplomats, and royals, Akkadian, Hittite, and Egyptian being those languages we found. And we know, interestingly, that there were at least 2 different Ugaritic alphabetic scripts that have been discovered. So this is one of our earliest alphabetic scripts in the world. And there were 2 different versions. One had 22 characters, which is closer to the later Phoenician, which is where much of our modern alphabet originates. And then a second version that had slightly more, 30 characters. So you can see here, this is the Ugaritic alphabet on sort of the left and in the background. And that tablet you see there on the right is one that scribes would have used when they were learning the alphabet. So if you think about the activity we did in class, carving our own little clay tablets, this would have been something that you would have used if you were studying as a scholar. And you can actually see, if you follow the alphabet A, B, G, H going down, you can actually see this is A, this is B, this is G, H, D, and so on. So this would have been something that would have been used by the scholars when they were learning how to write those basic letters, in this case the 22-letter alphabet. So an interesting sort of note with our contemporary times, those of you may have heard the phrase the hair of the dog as a sort of common urban slang for something to use to cure a hangover. Well, we have this story from one of these tablets known as El's Divine Feast. Now, El was the creator god. You can see his name there, also spelled E-L in the Ugaritic scripts there. And this is one of basically a poem or a story about this festival that was taking place for El, where many of the gods were involved. And I'm not going to bother to read the entire poem here. It's there if you want to refer to it. But basically, it's a wild party. El drinks a little too much, gets drunk, stumbles out of his house, runs into something that they've translated as a creeper, and there's a lot of debate about what this might have been, possibly a bull or some kind of an animal that has horns and a tail. There's a conflict between the two. El collapses down as if he is dying. Tablet reverses over on the backside, and it tells us that his wife and daughter, Atart and Anat, bring him back to life by basically placing what they call the hairs of a dog on his brow, including the top of a PQQ plant, which we don't know what that plant was, but it would have been a local plant there. as well as some virgin olive oil. So here we see the possible origins of this phrase, the hair of the dog, as a remedy to use to treat hangovers, going back several thousand years in this poem. You can see here the evolution. We talked a little bit about alphabetic scripts, and some of you have written about this in your different essays. So you see Ugaritic there at the top, and then as you move down, you can see the equivalent characters in the columns as it goes through the different time periods in different languages. And you can see by the time we get to about 700 BCE with the Greek, early Greek alphabet, we're getting something closer to what we know today. And then by about 200 BC, the modern Latin alphabet, the English language, and many others derive their origins from. You can see that transition from what we talked about as a pictographic or a visual style of symbol, eventually becoming into what we know as alphabetic characters today. So we know more about Ugarit than some other areas because of all the tablets that have been recovered there. And we know that there were both political and economic interactions going on across Egypt, Cyprus, Assyria, with the Hittites in Anatolia or modern Turkey, Carchemish, which is north of modern-day Syria, Tyre, Beirut, Amuru, and Mari, other areas or cities that we have records of, as well as from the Aegean, where the Mycenaeans and possibly even the Minoans would have been. And we know some of the things that were being traded from these lists. So we have luxury goods like alabaster jars, engraved swords, gold and silver cups, and other various sort of high status elite items that would have been traded by kings or perhaps priests or wealthy merchants. But we also have records of more sort of common things like wine, olive oil, wheat, dyed wool, garments, ebony wood, and plaques of different colored stones. So we know that all of these things are being traded at this time. But as our author notes, many of these things we don't have evidence of today because they're perishable goods. So obviously wheat or olive oil or wool is not going to last several thousand years buried in the ground. So if we look at the actual we saw the satellite maps earlier of Ugarit. So you can see over here in the center, this is a layout of some of the houses and tombs that they've excavated. You can see these tombs are sort of drawn in here. These would have been underneath the floors of these original excavation houses. And if you look over here on the left, another area. So this was what they called the archive building. So each of these little numbers that you see here spread out all throughout this area represent tablets that were found. So these different tablets that we have stories from, like that poem of El, and others are represented in that map as they've been found. And here you can see one of the wood steels of I believe this is Baal, who was one of the major kind of deities within Ugaritic society, and this is now in the temple. Now in the museum in Paris, but originally was at the temple on one of the mounds there in Ugarit. So we talked a little bit about some of the different tablet catches that were found and how we know about this period from those. So Yabnunu's house is one of them that was mentioned in the text. We know he was a successful merchant who was somehow affiliated with the palace. And within his house there, which you can see in this schematic on the right based on excavations, we had tablets written in Akkadian, Ugaritic, and Cypro-Minoan language, which we have still not translated today, but speaks to some of these international trade connections. Two other ones that our author mentioned, the house of Rapanu. So this was a scribe and a high-ranking advisor to one of the kings of Ugarit. We're not sure if it was Amis Tamaru II or someone else, that's still uncertain. But he was someone that was involved in high-level diplomatic negotiations with other kingdoms for the king. And then the house of Urtenu is another example. This was someone who worked in a large commercial trading firm of some kind, and were involved with trade between Ugarit, Cyprus, Egypt, and also other locations. So we think about how do we know some of these dates, and when we're trying to reconstruct these stories about what's going on, our author gives us a few different insights into the actual sort of science of archaeology and paleontology and some of the different sciences that go into helping tell us these historical stories. So in particular, a few ways we can do this is by looking at what's known as the fine contexts and sealed stratums. So you can see over here in this illustration on the right, As we know, over time, things get built up one on top of the other, and as you dig back through and excavate, we start to be able to discover layers on top of layers. You can see an example of sort of a 1 meter square trench that archaeologists would often use when they're excavating areas to be able to look at these stratum and to try to reconstruct which different periods are represented in those excavations. And when we find something sealed within one particular layer, that's a good indication that all of those items are from a particular time period and allows us to say this came before and this came after. Another example our author talks about are known as the stratified radiocarbon-based archaeology. So this is basically just being able to take one of these stratum, as you can see here in this illustration, and then date the isotopes to tell us how old are materials within that particular stratum, and then that can be used to reference how far back in time, and that matches with other evidence. Another is what he calls the anchor points in ancient epigraphic or literary sources. So these are basically stories or references to what was going on at that time, where were places located, what individuals, what peoples, what kingdoms, what other areas will help us date within, for example, references from the Hittites to the Egyptians or the Minoans to the Assyrians, so that we can use those as another way to figure out roughly what time were these events taking place. And similar to that, by looking at the names in many of these documents we've looking at, so the Amarna letters, these different stone tablets from Ugarit, by seeing references of different kings, Hittites, to Egyptians, to other within that sort of larger Levantine area, that allows us to say, okay, we know that this king was writing to this king, and we have a firm date for one king, so that allows us to correspondingly date a second king within a certain time period. And then lastly, and interestingly, they also point to astronomical observations. So we know this from Mayan and other sources in South America and Central America, that we can go back in time and date with fairly good precision when past events, astronomical events happen, like eclipses, and then use those to anchor other events that are referenced. So, for example, we know that if there was an eclipse that happened on January 21st of 1192 BCE, and that event is mentioned in one of these carved tablets, then we know that, for example, that settlement had to have still been active at least at that point and couldn't have been destroyed earlier, or there wouldn't have been a reference to those kind of astronomical events. So unlike some areas, Ugarit was entirely destroyed extremely violently sometime between about 1190 and 1185 BCE. We have evidence of massive burning, fights in the streets. So, for example, finding arrowheads stuck into the side of stones from having been fired. Interestingly, evidence of just how severe this was is that after this destruction, it was more than 600 years that the city basically sat abandoned before it was resettled by other peoples. And we also find other cities that were destroyed along this same time in this area, sort of Syria going down through Lebanon into what we would call the land of Canaan at this point of time. You can see some of those cities or areas like Emar, Ras Basit, Ras Ibn Hani, and Gibala that were mentioned in the text. But as our author mentions, we don't have good, clear evidence that this was caused by the sea people. There's a lot of speculation it was, but we can't say with 100% certainty. And we see further destruction south of Syria, examples of Megiddo, which we know as Armageddon from the biblical text, towns like Lachish, and we know that the Egyptian armies may have been involved in some of these acts of destruction. The Israelite tribes that, at least in theory, may have been either coming up from Egypt or were in the area around the same time and moving into the land of Canaan, may have caused some of this destruction. As I said, we have sea peoples as one possible explanation. And as our author mentioned, there's evidence for a whole series of about 50 years worth of earthquakes throughout this region. So these may also be to blame for at least some of the destruction. But we also see this in sort of more remote areas over in the Aegean areas of the Mediterranean. So we have Mesopotamia, where we've been looking at, and areas like Hatasa, which is going up into the Hittite areas of Anatolia, over to western modern-day Turkey, where Troy, city of Troy is, and then over into Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Cyprus. So we see this sort of wide range from Greek mainland, all the way over into Turkey, and then wrapping down around through Syria, Lebanon, that area we've been looking at over this last 1,000 years. Destruction in all of these areas. Now, one of the things that our author talks about is we've seen a lot of destruction, but also increasing what we might call hybridization. So in this period, towards the end of the 12th century, from about 1225 to 1180 BCE, we know there's been widespread destruction and collapse of kingdoms and reorganization of many areas, significant population movements around the Mediterranean. And as these people are moving, we don't know, are they conquering areas or are they just settling in areas that have been abandoned previously? And these are some of the questions that allow scholars to continue to debate about how we make sense of this historical era. So as our author Eric Cline says, in other words, we are looking once again at a globalized culture, reflecting a multitude of influences at the end of the Bronze Age just before they collapse. So another one of the sort of tidbits of historical miscellany that he gives us is what's known as the harem conspiracy. So this involved the assassination of Pharaoh Ramses III, who ruled from 1184 to 1155 BCE. And you can see a picture of his mummy there on the right. So we know that this, what's known as the harem conspiracy now, involved a minor wife of his, Queen Tai, who wanted her son, Pentawari, to ascend the throne. And this plot involved roughly 40 members of both the royal court and the harem. So there was a plot inside the harem and outside the court to basically lead a simultaneous coup so that they would be able to kill the pharaoh inside and then capture essentially what would have been the royal palace and grounds on the outside. Our author didn't talk about it as much, but apparently the queen and some of the conspirators sculpted a number of wax figures that then had magical spells put on them, the hope that it would either put the guards to sleep or in some way incapacitate them. And then these are involved, later we know from the charges in the judicial papers of Turin. And that we know that many of those involved were killed, some of them on the spot, and both the queen and her son were sentenced to death, although we don't know for sure if both of them were executed at that time. So we know about this story through what's referred to as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, and this recorded some of the events of the actual conspiracy itself, and especially, or more importantly, the court proceedings that followed. And we'll see a copy of this in a minute. But so this was a long sheet of papyrus paper that was at some point in the past stolen by a thief and cut into pieces. And then over time, historians and archaeologists eventually recovered them. Now, initially, people didn't actually know if Ramses III was killed in that assassination attempt or he died later. But we now know, after some CT scans that were done in 2012, that in fact he was assassinated, that he was basically stabbed through the throat, cut his thorax, his windpipe, and would have killed him instantly. But this wasn't known until the CT scan revealed it, because his neck had been wrapped in thick goslings or sort of cotton wraps, and then had an amulet placed over top of it. And where his mummy was found later, there was another body that's been unidentified, known as the body E, that was wrapped in goat skins, which would have been sort of ritually offensive at this time in Egypt, and were not mummified in the same way. So people think that this could have been the son, Pentawari, and this was his sort of punishment for his involvement in this plot. So you can see that today in the museum, this is the Judicial Papyrus of Turin that has been reconstructed. You can see about 4 or 5 different panels that have been stitched back together now. And this is where we have all the evidence about this harem conspiracy from. So if we turn to our last chapter 5, our author sort of wraps up this larger story we've been looking at about the rise, expansion, and then slow decline at the late Bronze Age of these different civilizations. And he begins with an homage to Sherlock Holmes' character from the stories, who famously tells us we must balance probability and choice, and when we're looking for the most likely answers. So our author suggests that maybe the best way to think about what was going on at this time was basically a perfect storm of calamities. So we know historians have debated a number of different reasons for the decline, and our author has walked us through those. So just as a review, some of the main ones involve earthquakes, climate change, in particular drought and famine linked to these climate changes, internal rebellions and political unrest. So these could have been taking place simultaneously or in different areas at different times, and would have been targeting most likely the palace elites. Invasion, which we've already talked about, either from the Sea Peoples or from other possible groups. For example, the Egyptians coming up into part of the land of Canaan. Disruptions of trade networks across the Mediterranean, and we've looked a lot at how important those trade networks were, so you can imagine that those being disrupted, as I think our author makes a good case for, could have led to significant repercussions throughout the region. And then finally, both the decentralization of political authority, as some of these elite palace civilizations start to break down, but also he mentions the rise of private merchants. So we may have seen a period of trade shifting from control by these kings and their sort of ruling groups to a wider network of merchants, which may have been themselves disrupted these older and established political networks of elite influence. But as our author ultimately mentions, it's impossible to isolate any single cause of the late Bronze Age collapse. So there is no single smoking gun. And he argues that linear narratives that tell us basically, the Sea People came in and they ravaged these areas and devastated them, and then that led to the collapse, is basically too simplistic. And it doesn't take into account the complexity of the story, the time periods across these different regions, as well as information that we just don't have to be able to fully tell an accurate story. So if we go back finally to think about the Sea People one more time, we know that they probably came from mainland Greece or somewhere in the Western Aegean, but also possibly parts of Western Turkey, Anatolia today. And they probably came in several waves over roughly a 40-year period, from somewhere around 1177, when we have the first records of the Egyptians fighting them, down to about 1130 or so. And we know that unlike the name Sea Peoples, they actually probably came both by sea and land. So they would have been essentially coming along the southern coast of Turkey, going over until they hit where the Mediterranean starts to go south, and then wraps along through modern-day Syria, Lebanon, down into Israel, Jordan, in Egypt, that area there. We also have enough evidence to suggest that there was probably a mix of both invasions and migrations, both by land and sea. So many people may have left the Greek mainland or sort of Western Anatolia because of some of these droughts or other conditions that were going on, local unrest, and essentially were moving east or south looking for a new start. They may have also been settling into cities that had already previously been abandoned, or areas that had maybe been destroyed but never been rebuilt. And this partly explains why we find some of these Aegean or Western Mediterranean artifacts like clay pots or other artifacts that we don't tend to associate with local indigenous Canaanite crafts or art or designs, but would explain why we don't find signs of battle. So people were moving in there, but not necessarily as conquerors. And as our author and others have highlighted, it may actually make more sense to think about this as a period of intermixing of local Near Eastern populations. So we get intercultural marriages of different families of both Aegean and Canaanite backgrounds, which were creating this hybridized or mixed Philistine culture in this land of Canaan, from Egypt in the south all the way up to Syria in the north, and maybe even wrapping around into part of south central Turkey where the Hittite Empire was. So our author suggests that maybe systems collapse is a better way to think about how we can try to explain this period of late Bronze Age collapse. So when we're talking about a systems failure, we're talking about sort of both a domino and a multiplier effect at the same time, and considering these late Bronze Age civilizations as basically a series of interconnected systems. So for example, he talks about Colin Renfrew, who in 1979 proposed the catastrophe theory as a way to think about system collapse. And he outlined sort of 4 general aspects that might help us think about how smaller chain reactions can actually lead to a larger system being pulled down. So he highlights, for example, the collapse of central administrative organizations. So we can imagine these being the, imperial palaces in Mycenae, and Hattusa of the Hittites, and Ugarit, and Knossos and the Minoans. Different examples of these central administrative organizations slowly collapsing. The disappearance of the traditional elite class. So this would have taken part at the same time that these central administrative organizations were breaking down. Third, he talks about the collapse of the centralized economy, which is linked both to the disruption of these centralizing sort of political organizations, but also possibly due, as we mentioned earlier, to the rise of possibly an independent merchant class who was taking some of that economic power away from the palaces. And then finally, settlement shifts and population decline. So this could both be population decline and settlement shifts due to local disruptions, or settlements moving to other areas leading to local population declines. So as our author talks about, this interdependence of all these late Bronze Age civilizations may have actually made them more vulnerable to collapse because of the political, trade, interconnections, the reliance on food, that if, for example, a prolonged period of drought, as our author talks about, may have happened, and you can no longer rely on, for example, Egypt sending you grain when you need it, or the Hittites sending you grain. Although those tie in and overlap with the trade and political networks, they could have made those links more vulnerable. So what we saw from the 15th to the 13th century, the period we've been looking at, these major civilizational areas, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Canaanites, and the Cypriots, basically over this 200 or 300 year period have gone from large, extensive, interconnected civilizational systems and kingdoms with extensive trade networks across the Mediterranean and Aegean to, by the time we get down to about 1177 or 1150 in some areas, most of these entirely collapsed or on the verge of collapse. So authors suggest, instead of this earlier kind of linear narrative about sea peoples coming in and disrupting and leading to collapse, we might learn something valuable from approaching these kind of questions in this history from the lens of complexity theory. So thinking about the complex interdependence of these Bronze Age civilizations may have actually made them more likely to collapse, as I mentioned. And he walks us through very briefly some of the aspects of complexity theory, and a full exposition is beyond this class, but a couple of the key points that he hits on that I want to highlight here is the idea that a system contains a collection of many interacting objects or agents. So in this case, the system would be this sort of late Bronze Age interconnected civilizational network of trade and politics and culture and arts and interaction. Each of those represent a different object or an agent in this larger Bronze Age Mediterranean system. And the behavior of the objects or agents can be affected by feedback from past experiences. So as time evolved, these civilizations adapted and learned what was working, what wasn't. And we talked about some of the various ways that we can see these evolutions through military, technological advances, language advances, etc. Complexity theory argues that a system is alive and can evolve in organic and unpredictable ways. So we can think about the Mediterranean and these civilizations themselves as dynamic, interconnected pieces or parts of this larger system, which is also open, which is the next part there, that can be affected by outside or environmental factors. And this is where thinking about the Bronze Age being disrupted by sea peoples or other groups that are either invading or migrating into new areas, the disruption of established elite networks, disruption of trade networks, and also impacts from climate change such as drought and famine. All of these would be impacting this kind of open civilizational system in the area of the Mediterranean. And then lastly, this idea that systems can exhibit surprising or extreme phenomena. So basically the connection here is that, as our author says, it's not surprising that these civilizations collapsed because civilizations before them and after them collapsed, but how rapidly they collapsed and the sources of those collapses themselves can't be sort of predicted within the way we think about these organizations in the historical narratives. Even though we know that they were going to happen, how and why they happened are always sort of a mystery, particularly in this time period when we don't have all of the information about how these different factors may have been affecting individual kingdoms within this broader network. But ultimately, our author argues that complexity theory gives us a better sort of explanation or a better handle on how to think about these diverse Bronze Age civilizations being impacted by multiple different and unexpected forces over a period of time that, although one of them by themselves wouldn't have been enough to cause collapse, when you combine them all together over a period of time, interacting in unexpected and innovative ways, earthquake, climate, there's drought and famine, for example, invasions, migrations, internal political unrest, and shifting trade. All of these together essentially create this perfect storm that he talks about. And importantly, as he mentions towards the end and also in his afterwards that we'll talk about next week, we know that all civilizations have collapsed in the past. There's no civilization today that was in existence from the earliest period. And we know that all civilizations will once again collapse in the future, including our own. So it's not a matter of if civilizations will collapse, but rather when and why do they collapse. And that leads us sort of back to the point of this class and looking at this time period in the context of thinking about earlier eras of globalization, which is what can history teach us about the present? And then I'll end this with asking folks to watch this third part of the series that we've been looking at so far, the Bronze Age mini-series, which will wrap up and sort of highlight some of these issues that we've been looking at so far in class. Okay, that's it for this last lecture on week 4, and we'll move into the very last part of the aftermath and reflections